Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Let's Dev, where today we continue working on converting the real-world game of Gob Gobblers into a video game. Now, last time we built the base mechanics for the game. This consisted of my first ever attempt at creating a tic-tac-toe style game and a size comparison system that mirrored the functions of the original Gob Gobblers. It was a surprisingly smooth and successful first attempt that only left us with one major issue, which we'll attempt to fix as part of today's plan. Indeed, we will be fleshing out the remaining aspects of our game as well as fix any issues that may need fixing. We'll also be implementing the visual aspects of our game, and finally we'll review our progress after adding a few final bells and whistles. Sounds like a plan, so let's get to the coding. First, let's cover what I've done between videos. The player markers were added to the game, which are powered by a ton of hotspots and data. The marks' positions are kept track of via DS list and are drawn to the screen based on said data. Markers share all the same sprites but also scale down in size based on their tiers. The mouse hotspots are grid-based, and thanks to some math, the mouse's position returns the corresponding marker's position in their respective DS lists. It was a very long and tedious effort. So first up was getting the markers to follow the mouse on pickup, which was done via left-click check while the mouse is not on the grid. If the mouse has picked up a marker, that marker's data is then temporarily stored, and its position is updated to follow the mouse, which ended up working just fine thanks to our use of matrices, though the conditional meant it only worked when not on the grid. So the move code was taken out of that conditional check to make it universal. Then the right-click check was updated to reset the pickup event and return the marker to its default position. Next, the size check was updated to refer to the stored data, and each side's markers were temporarily colored differently for better clarity during testing, which were not exactly successful. After breaking down the code and testing each part individually, I realized I was simply getting my data references confused. Once the wires were untangled and markers could be placed, a major oversight dawned on me. Markers are created and documented in ascending order. Meanwhile, the size checks are in descending order, meaning the lower tiered markers were stronger than the higher tiered markers. So instead of going back and redoing a bunch of the listing in draw code, the best course of action seemed to be to reverse all the size checks. Which means instead of checking for sums greater than 0, we check for sums less than 12. Then new code was added to check for stalemates. The new code checks the sum of the grid, and if it's below 13, it then checks for the highest number stored in the grid. If there are no signs of a 4, that means the board is full and no winner has been declared. Thus, it must be a draw. And after a ton of testing and tweaking, this managed to end up working. So, unexpected detour aside, we were finally ready to move on to some visual stuff. A couple global arrays were added, which would use equally global default colors I added between videos. Then in the draw event, the visual pieces of our markers were added. Originally, this was attempted via loop, which didn't end up working as I'd hoped. So instead, the 3 pieces were hard-coded, with colors of each piece being determined based on the global arrays. And finally, we were no longer using simple colored shapes. Now we had actual art with some personality and individuality. Mild individuality. So with the colors working, it was time to take care of that white box that keeps popping up. Similar to the player's markers themselves, this box was meant to display the color and tier of a marker occupying that spot. So just like the markers, the box and its contents would be colored based on the global array data. And while we were coloring things, the winner's color would then be used during the endgame display, with white being used for draws. And there we had it, our conversion of Gob Gobblers to video game format. First thing to note is that had objects been used, this would have been far less complicated. However, the allure of building this entire thing in a single object was too tempting. Now, full transparency, I had a lot more bells and whistles planned for this session, but the unexpected hitches meant I just didn't have the time. Some of the features included color customization and faces, some extra HUD elements and effects, and some remaining polish. Which means I technically could do one more episode. That is, if you guys were interested in seeing those additions. To be honest, I set out to convert a board game into a video game, and I think I accomplished my goal. Anything extra at this point would just be icing on the cake. And personally, this experiment was awesome, and it's encouraged me to seek out other board games to remake as video games. So expect more of these types of projects in the future. But whether or not we continue this or move on to something else, that'll do it for this episode of Let's Delve. So remember to leave a like if you enjoyed the episode, subscribe and turn on notifications if you haven't already, and leave your thoughts on our progress in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.